without any further ado, we're going to ask that Dr. Strobel, Mary Hope Strobel, come forward to introduce our keynote speaker. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to RI. I'm glad that so many people made it. So I cannot begin to tell you what an honor it is for us to have Dr. Carmen Giselle Huamani Ober with us tonight. Giselle was my classmate. She was a couple years ahead of me when I was at SCAR, at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University. And when I first arrived, like everybody told me, have you met Giselle? You have to meet Giselle. So I did finally meet her, and her reputation, she lived up to her reputation. What I can talk about mostly is what I know, what she did during graduate school, which was she jumped right in, and she was a founder or co-founder of an NGO called the Alliance for Conflict Transformation that did work all over the world. They got government and other foundation contracts and grants and whatnot. She also led a project, a gentrification. There was a gentrification was happening in Northern Virginia at the time I lived there, and there was a humongous housing complex called the Arna Valley Complex that was where mostly El Salvadorian immigrants lived, and they were being moved out. And there was the company that was doing the development had an ombudsman person, but in fact they were very much working for the company. And Giselle led a project and gathered all of those of us who spoke a couple words of Spanish to help her on this project. Since then, she has gone on to, the next experience that I had with Giselle was that we trained together with our colleague Craig Zellenzer, who most of you have heard of, in Lithuania. And I have to say that Giselle is probably one of the best trainers that I have ever had the pleasure to work with. And all the participants, they were from all over Eastern Europe and the former Soviet states, and they all loved her, and Craig and I kind of looked at each other like, they don't like us so much, they love Giselle though, right? But, and so since then, since she left Virginia, she has worked all over the world, and she's worked with a wide variety of international organizations, as well as in Peru. She's worked with organizations such as and I think this will interest a lot of you who are working on Ombudsman's projects. She worked with the Peruvian National Ombudsman's Office, which is one of the most well-known in Latin America and considered one of the most successful in Latin America. And she has also worked a lot on issues of extractive industries, where mining and hydrocarbon companies have gone in to communities, especially indigenous companies, and she's worked on conflict resolution in those contexts, which is incredibly important. And so I think now she's a professor, and she's teaching at a university in Peru, whose name I can't remember, but she can tell you. And otherwise, I hope that those of you who attended the Latin America Working Group meeting were able to learn a lot more about the work that she's doing. So I'm going to now hand it over to her, and she can fill you in on other aspects of her contributions. Thank you, Giselle.
Hello with everyone. Hello. It is a pleasure to be here with you, and also to have the opportunity to exchange ideas, experiences. Many of you have been in the field, and we are all here to learn. So I want to thank Michelle for the invitation, and also to Mary Hope for this opportunity to share with me have this opportunity and to share with you about a topic that is called infrastructure for peace. How many of you have heard that term? No? One? Not in this side? No, nobody? Well, infrastructure for peace is, we'll say it's a term that has been developing during the last 10 years. And it's trying to look at the peace efforts from a more systemic way. So what I'm going to be talking is about these different efforts that different societies have been doing, especially in this context of deeply divided societies. Many of you in the meeting that we had with the Latin American Working Group, they were asking about how can they advance careers, how can they do work on the field. And I think that Infrastructure for Peace will give us this opportunity to have an overlook about what is going on or what is the potential for developing specific pieces, protocol, mechanisms, platforms, or even programs that will help building peace. So on one hand, people have talked about infrastructure for peace, and there is one news that came, a journal in peace and development that came 3 years ago, in which different authors, I was writing one of the articles, contribute with different concepts about what infrastructure for peace is. And Jean-Paul Lederach was developed the beginning of that journal. But it has many elements that are very interesting and are relevant to our discussion today. So I want to compare or bring into this talk about 3 or 4 cases. One is the Peruvian case, and even Mary Hope was referring about the Ombudsman office in Peru, which has done amazing work in terms of conflict management. I actually was ahead of the Office for Conflict Management within the Ombudsman in the year 2017. So I can share with you some of the efforts being done from the perspective of the Ombudsman. But also I want to bring in the cases related to all the Latin American countries, but also the comparison with Indonesia, which I was there just for a month, and Guinea Equatorial, which is another country typical from Africa, but that they are doing also efforts to trying to develop some mechanisms for conflict management. And I think that there are some ethical questions that I will pose to you at the end. But also I want to leave to you a case study, which is very interesting, is the Kenyan case study, in which I think it was the most interesting effort in how to develop infrastructure for peace from different perspectives, different sectors, different levels, and which was able to stop the violence. I don't know if you remember the electoral violence in 2008 that took at least 1,500 lives. So even with that, I think that the Kenyan case is something that we can all learn. Even with their own early warning system, which has led the space or the road for the famous software, I don't know if you have heard, that is called Ushahidi. Have you heard of Ushahidi? Yes? And it is actually a model for how to alert, especially not only for health crisis, but especially in application for conflict management. So when, let's see, this works like this. No, it works like this. Yes. We need to understand how there are different stages in how societies start thinking and developing conflict management. They can be protocol, mechanisms, institutions, etc. In the case of Peru, we can say that in the 80s, we were in the middle of an internal war that took the life of 70,000 people. But we didn't have time to think of anything else. It was just a war that torn us apart. However, in the world, not only in Peru, in the 90s starts happening this movement into liberalization of the market liberalization. And then even though with the political crisis, the economic expansion, the political and economic crisis, and also latent environmental crisis, then slowly many international organizations, many international financing companies and banks start promoting specific mechanisms for arbitration, and for mediation. And I can say that there is a turning point at the end of the 90s, the beginning of 2000, in which there is a transition in many countries, and I've seen that in Indonesia, I've seen it in other countries, in Latin America especially, in which all these efforts from the different banks are to regulate or to stabilize the economic relationships. That means how to bring more security to transactions, more security to the exchange. So there's a very interesting trend in Latin America and in other continents in which the mediation was promoted as a way of modernizing the judicial system. So we can say that by the 2000, the beginning of 2000, there is these transitions, many transitions. It's very interesting. In Indonesia also there is a transition to democracy. However, the environmental conflicts we are talking about post-Rio summit start becoming more apparent. From latent, they start becoming open conflicts. And that happens, and that's the question, whether are more projects being developed in specific areas that starts putting in a critical situation many of the social situations in many countries. So I want to show you this map. This is the one done for Peru. There is a similar one for different countries on how the different laws start evolving, developing. In the case of Peru, of course, the law related to mining evolves pretty much earlier than the laws related to the environment. But it is very late, around the 90s, in which the norms related to social issues start developing. And the norms related to conflict management, they start developing just on the 2000, 2006, and so on, because of the amount of conflicts and tensions and disputes that were appearing, especially related to extractive industries. So we can say that around 2000, the need for having some kind of social stability makes the government start developing the first teams for conflict analysis, the first teams for conflict advisory role, and from there start evolving these teams with and changing the role from analysis to facilitation and to intervention. So if we do a mapping, and this is just an illusory, but it's the bell where I'm going to map the different initiatives more or less from 1983. I did this study in which me and my colleagues, we put all the different initiatives where in the stage of the conflict they start appearing. More or less, the bell looks like this. I have to add to this that there has been around 600 spaces or tables or processes, dialogue processes, in which half of them have appeared after the crisis, that means around here, and half of them, 50%, have appeared before the crisis. That means 50% of the tables or spaces or processes are set, they are agreed to work before the crisis appears, and 50% appear after a crisis, a violent action, confrontation, or even death has occurred. So if you see, and if we put all the different 600 tables, that will be 600 little dots around this peak, we will see that there is a heavy focus on crisis management, no? And there is actually a very few initiatives that they are working on prevention when there is escalation, and even less initiatives that will work on de-escalation or even in these processes of reconciliation. So our approach, or at least the one that had been developing throughout the years, has been marked very much for the crisis rather than to having a proactive and preventive approach. And that is something that is not new to Peru and is not unique to Peru. And I will say that many different countries, they also have that focus into crisis management rather than preventive role. And that's one question that we should raise from this map, in which we should be very critical about the mechanisms and the protocols that are not being sufficient at this level, and which should be improved, should be revised, because something is not sufficiently good in this point for the amount of conflicts that they are still escalating to the point of crisis. So, what is the purpose then of ADR and all these other conflict management initiatives? And if we see the different channels or avenues for trying to resolve conflicts, we have political actions, we have social action, we have ADR, we have sometimes using conflict, bad conflict with pressure, even with force, and sometimes with violence. We have the judicial channel, and we have the public policy actions. We need to see all these different channels and in relationship with one another. What is going on with each one of them? How are they supporting each other, or what is it with one that is not working so that people are using specific alternative mechanisms? Typically, the judicial channel has been a way of trying to resolve traditional conflicts, and we have seen that throughout Latin America and in many other continents, the judiciary channel is in crisis. And many of in Peru, I don't know if you have been looking at the news, but some of the few scandals that has occurred has involved some of the top court judges. But usually these two channels have a great potential into feeding into each other, into trying to setting the bar, setting certain cases which need to be resolved by the judicial system, and other aspects of the cases that can be resolved by ADR. And in some of the countries in which the institutions are very weak, we can see that this relationship or this connection is very troublesome. In some countries where the court system is very weak, then these two mechanisms, they work in parallel and they pretty much ignore each other. However, there is a great potential for all these ADR, alternative dispute resolution mechanisms and processes, to work precisely on the relationship in those personal aspects that usually the judicial system will not be able to resolve. However, we need to ask ourselves as practitioners, what are the implications of our work from ADR to the public policies? Are they a completely separate channel? Are we impacting somehow those public policies? Or they don't have anything to do with the work that we are trying to do? And that has a serious implication, because we may be conforming to the different injustices in society, and we are not trying to change the structural causes or the deep issues that may be behind the conflicts. So also social action and even political action, they need to be considered as alternative and complementary channels that will also enhance or will empower or make central also the ADR work. And when we are thinking about conflict, often we see this channel of the actors looking into the different channels to see which ones is more available, which one of them can be used in terms of addressing deep issues or trying to impact deep-rooted causes. So the way of thinking about how the conflicts are being channelized and how social needs and claims are being addressed is that we need to see not only conflict management, but also the other channels and see how our process complements and work with these other channels. There are some issues that definitely need to go to the court system because they need to set a jurisprudence. There are some other issues that, because of the nature of the problem, they need to be changed at the information, which will allow you to see trends and to even do further research. So in the case of Peru, we have around 1,100 cases since 2004. And in these cases, we can see even and cross the information about regions, about type of conflicts, about, for example, change of policies, no? Even the type of governments and what kind of conflict management do they have. My hypothesis is that how the governments, they manage conflict, they can impact the conflict into escalate it into crisis, or they can resolve and transform the conflict. That means the conflict management capacity of the states is a very important variable to measure in our analysis and in our studies. So when we are looking at the pictures and the trends, we can also cross this information, and we have done it in Peru, to see how they are related also with specific policies. And one of the policies that I see a trend in Latin America and also in Indonesia has to do with the socio-environmental conflicts. And I was mentioning to the Latin American Working Group that we call it in Latin America socio-environmental because it is the relationship of the human with the environment what makes this complex situation. It's not just environmental itself, it's how the human uses the environment. So one of the interesting things about these patterns is the amount of conflicts that are appearing. Half of them are in a dialogue process, but 41% of those conflicts are in the poorest districts of the country. And that's a very worried, concerning number, because that means that the poorest districts, the poorest municipalities, are the ones who are somehow getting worse from these situations. So 41% is not a small figure, but it tells us about the trends that are happening with the conflicts around environment around the world. So 60, and it's incrementing from 60 to around 64, and I think this month is around 70%. But the conflicts related to social environmental has been growing from 40% when we start measuring in 2004, steadily has been growing to 40, 50%, 60%, and now close to 70%. Of course, all the other cases are related to other very important topics, but what is very relevant here is how social environmental conflicts are related to mining, hydrocarbon, energy, water, saneamiento, agroindustrial, and forestry. This makes us conclude that some of the characteristics of the social conflicts, as it was before, is that now they're highly complex, especially when they are related to environment. That knowing the technical problem, measuring with the tools and the procedures and with the science that has been developed so far until today, is that we can only understand and know part of the technical problem related to environmental conflict. The other aspect is that there is a tendency, and there is also the frustration for even technicians and also public officers in trying to measure the problem, the environmental problem, in pieces, in sections. And actually, there is a lot of interdependence among the different factors. Water, forestry, land. There is no way of cutting and saying the problem of land stops here, but it's related one element with another. And also it keeps changing, and it's very dynamic. So many of the measures and the studies that can be done in one point in time, they are not relevant a few years later. The other aspect is that to this social conflict, it adds, there are other layers that makes the situation more difficult to handle. And it has to be with the power of the different institutions. It has to do with the institutions, how strong or weak they are. For example, there is a famous case now called Las Bambas, which was a US and then Canadian company, and now there is a Chinese company that has been changing owners. But what they are saying now in the last study is that it was the problem of the environmental institutions not to have the correct tools, not responding quickly, not doing enough to try to study and comprehend the diversity and the difficulty and the complexity of this problem, environmental problem related to this case. So there are many aspects that they add to the problem, whether it is spillover or there is a contamination and there is an impact. But also the cultural aspect, which is a very important aspect of most of the conflicts that has to do with the local cultures, that's something in which either public officers nor companies have the cultural competencies or have the abilities or the predispositions, in sometimes are the cases, to dialogue, to have an intercultural dialogue with the local actors. The other aspect that is important for these kind of conflicts, especially when they are related to environment or when they are related to the development, that the parties tend to understand or think that the issues are of private matters, and they are not. That means that environmental conflicts, because it's environment and because there is a public interest, that means the environment will affect everyone, we are not talking about private issues, private interests. We are talking about public issues. Therefore, companies and communities cannot be negotiating in private. They need to involve the local government in the local form or the institutions that need to supervise, accompany, and monitor those processes. The same happens with development. We can say the companies are doing well, they are giving us a gift, a soccer field or a library or different things. But when we're talking about development, one thing is your social will to give all these things, but the other thing is when you are becoming an agent for development. And when we're talking about development, the local government and the regional and the national government, they are the ones who need to facilitate the development of the local population. So if we have territorial plans, if we have local environmental and social zonification, not anybody can come and say, oh, I'm going to build a road here and there. There are, or if they don't have it, they need to work on that, in those plans, but development is not a private issue, it is a public interest issue. So one of the trends that I was observing in many countries in Latin America is that whatever the private companies were providing, because it was a good for the community, somehow it was received without thinking about, in the long term, how the companies can be agents for development. Therefore, one of the models that have been evolving very strongly in Latin America is this model of multi-stakeholders for development, in which private companies are one more actor in these processes into planning, thinking about resources, and summing all the different efforts and monies and other resources into reaching that vision of development of the local communities. The other aspect that it has been very common, I will say, in either it's in Africa or it's in Asia and Latin America, is how there are these different worldviews that we just take for granted and thinking, oh, we're talking about the same thing. And it's not. Even for thinking in one case in one Andean country, and I will share with you this story, even one case about educational benefits. I was called to try to mediate a case in which companies and communities, they were in a big fight because of the educational benefits. And I thought, but educational benefits sounds good, isn't it? Sounds good? Yeah, who doesn't want to have educational benefits? However, when asking the different actors what it meant, educational benefits, for the community who was very traditional, meant funds. Educational fund for the whole community. And for the company, it meant scholarships. And they both got stuck and very positioned, scholarship versus educational fund. And they were at a point of having a big crisis because of these different worldviews that they had in turn around the educational benefits. For the community, scholarship meant the best and the brightest of the youth, they were going to leave the communities. They weren't going to return back. They weren't coming back after the school. That meant that they could go on into higher education. Who knows who was going to accompany them, if they were going to be good citizens or not. For them, it meant forgetting the best, the bright, the youth. For the company, it meant, in its own words, it was to reward the best, to reward and appraise those who make the best effort. So you could see how the more individual worldview of the company, it was something good to give scholarships. So that young who was making his best effort was going to go to a higher education. But for the communities, they said, no, we want the fund, at least a little bit for everyone. Just a little bit so that we all go up little by little, but together. There were fundamental values different from one and another. For the community, the scholarship meant a threat to their own identity, meant a threat to the future. But the company, the scholarship meant a way of having accountability to see where the investment went and to be able to measure success in terms of the individuals. So often, in those different worldviews, it seems that we're speaking about the same language. We're speaking about the same concept, but actually we have different narratives behind those words. And in many of the conflicts, I will say maybe 99% of the cases, we have different models, different views, different worldviews about what is development and how to get there. And of course, there is a big power asymmetry that has come from the colonial times, in which people don't forget and where people make association about the next power that is coming into the area. So there is great power asymmetry that it keeps going deeper, and also a big distrust among the different actors. So when we are talking about all these conflicts and social environmental conflicts, many of the public officers, they have tried to do more explaining, having meetings to explain in detail about the greatness or the technical details. But really what we are talking about is deep and historical distrust. And that usually cannot be overcome with a meeting, or it cannot be overcome with a big book on the benefits of the environmental impacts assessment. So it is, I think that the conflicts that we are facing today, there are more actors, and that makes it more challenging. There are also multiple issues that they keep adding, so it makes it more difficult to facilitate. Multiple causes, multiple dimensions, multiple scenarios, and now the local communities, they not only do their advocacy work at the local level, they also use the media, they use international channels to try to face and voice their grievances. So that also makes it more complicated, the conflict cases. And they also use multiple strategies for dealing with the issues. So, are we still working on this? I will say that these are the challenges of the conflicts that we are facing today. And they become, I think, depending on the background of the different countries, they may become polarized very quickly. So when we talk about infrastructure for peace, why do we need to think about infrastructure for peace? Because precisely the conflicts that we are facing, they are more complex. And they have all these sides that I was explaining to you. So that's why it's necessary to think about more systemic ways on how to deal with issues that every time are becoming more global. And a concept that was brought from the Kenyan the Forum of African Countries in Kenya, it says it's the dynamic network of interdependent structure, mechanisms, resources, values, and skills which through dialogue and consultation contribute to conflict prevention and peace building in a society. And I think Jean-Paul Nederac took this concept too and added networks, platform, and also all of them that they are capable of learning and to adapt to face the challenges of the conflict situation. So this is the concept that I will be using to go very quickly into this effort on Peru about how to develop infrastructure for peace. This part is about how the official government developed different capacities in the different ministries. All of them along the years, they have developed teams, and each team has developed their own database. And the database has been monitoring conflicts in their own sector, and they have an early warning system, and they have a monitoring system, and they are doing different initiatives, dialogue between companies, the state and the communities. They have different experiences, very interesting. And all of them kind of, they are developing capacities over the years when they start going into school, into universities to learn about conflict management. Even the police, the coronels, they are also going to school to learn about conflict management. So I have had like six different years of coronel from the police. They, for example, they say there must be another way of handling conflict. It cannot be, and they said that we are used as a carne de cañón, which is in English, a what?
Cannon fodder.
Yeah. That means we cannot be as a parche, like a patch. We cannot be used as a patch.
A bandit.
Or a bandit. We are often put in these situations in which we can only use the force, and we are tired of it. So the interesting thing is that MININTER, which is Ministerio del Interior Ministry, have been interested in also how the police can play a role in mediation. Colombia, for example, they have the figure of police mediators. And that's a very interesting role for many situations in which the actors can benefit from somebody with the skills and also with the authority. But if you can see in the water ministry or the agriculture ministry and the water authority in production, in labor, in housing, in transportation, mining, in environment, all of the different sectors have figured out that they need to be prepared to handle the conflicts in their own sector. But the Prime Minister is the one that handles conflicts that are intersectorial and that they are more complex. So this is a list of different institutions, but not only, we can see also that the development of institutions for conflict management develop at the regional level. And these are the 15 different governments that also figure out that at their regional level, they also needed to develop teams, protocols, and mechanisms, because they are the ones who sees, observes, or suffers the conflict first. So they say the national government is too far. They come too late. We need to be prepared and we need to do something about it. So how do we see all of this? And using Lederach framework, we have the national, the regional, and the local level. And we can see how at the national level there are different institutions, even in UNDP and the OAS, and the other international organizations, and even the church and faith groups. At this national level, they have a role to play. And the Ombudsman office is an institution that is also over there. But also at the regional level, we have different organizations, and sometimes they interact with each other. But at the regional level, they also have platforms and different mechanisms. And at the local level, we can say that that's where we need to work more. It's at the local leadership. That means how, at the local level, those who are natural mediators or who are the original mediators, the ones that know how to deal with the actors, that know the culture, also can play an important role. And I think I was commenting in the group early on, the Latin American Working Group, that many of the cooperation efforts, international cooperation efforts, has been geared at this level, but very little into developing capacities and leadership at the local level. And I think that's a terrible missing opportunity. So Lederach, Jean-Paul Lederach, it says that precisely if we are thinking on how to articulate different initiatives, we need to see how all these different institutions, platforms, agents, they all talk to one another. And how facing different risks and challenges, they are able to take the lead on. So just to mention, there are different protocols and tools that have been developing over the years. We have conflict mapping and diagnostics, in which you can even see how the countries are divided in areas of conflict that are active or are latent. We can see also how we measure frequencies, and we can see tendencies and trends, and that's very interesting to be able to develop these tools so that it helps with decision makings and also public policy. We can report by type of conflicts, and that will help to see how different areas are being not taken care, and what the government or the different organizations can try to look at the policies that are not working. We can also look at different instruments and either for socializing or making alerts. And the Swahili tool, I'm hoping to be able to look at it. But there is the problem conflict mapping tool that's in a participatory way of how the local communities can map themselves. This is a project that I was mentioning. It was done in the Amazon, and the people, women, children, and men, they were doing their mapping, identifying where in the communities had the issues, conflict issues, and they made these beautiful maps on how the community looked and where the conflicts were. And this is how they're explaining and returning the information to the community. You can do these problem conflict mappings too. I think that we as a practitioner, as an analyst, we can use many of these analytical tools to strengthen many of these participatory processes so that people can learn about their issues, their problem, and be proactive and organize themselves, but also into learning how other parties see the issues and the problems and how even they see the timeline. And this is a very interesting tool in which these actors from two different watersheds, the high watershed and the low watershed, in conflict for 55 years. They were in this area talking for the first time about what the issues were, and we start doing a tool, this timeline. And if you can see, it was a whole room, pretty much like this one, and we put paperwork everywhere, and we start doing the line and with events, and each one of the actors, they were learning the perspective on the timeline and creating a unified history or unified narrative of the history of the conflict. So the timeline, often you can do it with companies and communities. You can do it tracing each one of the problems, how they have become an issue, how they have been creating crisis, and how what were each one of the actors doing in a specific point on time. So there are several tools that we are learning, or you're learning in your studies, or you're going to learn in your studies, which help us as an analyst to understand better, but moreover, help the parties to understand better what are the perspectives of the different actors about the issues, about the history, about the process. So, conflict scenario tools, it's a very interesting one to put the different actors in possible situations in the future, in the present, for escalation, for resolution, or if we get not moving in stagnation. But even with all those tools, even with all those protocols and those issues, there are still some pending issues, and I want to close in and wrap in my presentation. One is there's still a lot of political instability in many of our countries. In Latin America, I will say in many developing countries. The dialogue spaces are not the solution, and they are not to replace the state in the functions that they need to perform. So in Peru, there was a tendency that every problem we will open up a dialogue table. And the risk is that you start creating shortcuts for the state to do what the state should be doing through the dialogue processes. And so we need to be aware that one thing is the function of the state, and the other thing is these processes just to solve the issues, to solve the conflicts, and therefore the state needs to take on the responsibilities. So many of these facilitators, or these officers, public officers, or even consultants, some of you are thinking or already work as a consultant, cannot replace the relationship that needs to happen between perhaps the company and the community, or between one group in the community and another. And often there is this tendency as a consultant to try to start, because it's easier, we understand better, to start developing those social relationships. But we have to be very clear about our third role, and we need to promote the parties for them to develop their own social relationship. There is also still a big challenge for interstate coordination and collaboration. And there is this culture of non-collaboration among different public agencies, institutions, and officers. There is this jealousy about how the other going is to perform. So there is the need to foster this collaboration and complementation culture. Because even opening dialogue spaces or tables, the negotiation tables, not all the agents from the public officers are going to collaborate. So we need to work with them prior and deliberately into how to create a culture in which collaboration is desirable. We need to improve with our system to manage, to monitor, and to do follow-up on the agreements. In the case of Peru, there are 1,598 agreements that are being not fulfilled from a total of almost 3,000 agreements, and that's almost 54% of the cases. So nowadays, there are many softwares, many technologies that could help improve our capacities to manage the cases and to monitor the agreements. The other thing that is very interesting that I've seen it and I heard it often and often in the last years is the need to have an approach for a territorial approach to conflict management. That means we cannot be looking at one case, just a single unit case, but we need to look at territorial, how the different units or the different cases are relating to each other. Especially when we are talking about environmental conflicts. We need to have another lens that involves how the different elements work with each other within a specific territory. That means water, land, if there are issues of immigration or if there are economic issues, we need to see all the different pieces, how they all work with each other. And not just my case and I don't see anything else, okay? So when we are talking about peace infrastructures, we need to look at the social capital. That means how the civil society, the networks, how this encounter between private civil society and the states happens more often. This is what, for John Paul Lederer, he stresses a lot this point of the platforms and this coordination between the private and the public. So far I've seen many of the governments, they are putting a lot of interest in developing capacities. But when we are talking about how do you outreach to the civil society, that's where the car stops a little. You know, they are entering into another territory. And we need actually to promote more of it. So it's correct, we need to strengthen institutional capacity, but institutional capacity that also is in the participatory processes on how to relate to civil society, in how to work with teams that know and understand the local culture and that can be able to have other perspective on the work. So alliances with civil society, rather than looking at them as enemies or a completely different world, is what we need to foster. So I'm going to, and of course teach peace, which is the main aspect in terms of the culture of peace that is so little being implemented through the school curricula, the universities. Right now at the university we have people 30, 40 years old all taking courses in conflict management, but this is really very, it tells us about what is lacking in our educational system, what the schools are not teaching, what values are missing. So we need to start with teaching peace from the early on. And so when we see how all societies get involved, I'm familiar with multitrack diplomacy, and I'm sure that you have heard also multitrack diplomacy, and really how the different tracks, they can work together, really, and see how they can bring different resources, different expertise, different intelligences, and different processes, whether we are talking about different capacities. And I would say that in many of the cases, critical cases in which I've been working in Peru, often we have been trying to map, okay, who are in these different institutions? Who are in the middle, in the media, that can help us with one particular case? So it is a very interesting framework, but it's also very useful into tracking and identifying different actors, and especially in how to work with all of them. The synergy, it's possible to create synergy to handle and to intervene in very different cases. And this is the last one, but I wanted to leave you with this, is that something that I also notice in many of the cases in Latin America is that often the focus is in indigenous, actually in non-indigenous groups in society. That means you are going to use alternative dispute resolution systems, you are going to use the judiciary, the administrative, and other channels. But we say, okay, for indigenous people, they can use their own mechanisms, the original dispute resolution processes. And if they have a problem, they are going to use their original methods that can be the apus in Peru, or the peasant wrongs, or the other mechanisms, so the indigenous mothers will play a role. There's a whole set of different mechanisms that research has been identifying as the way how traditionally many communities have resolved conflicts. But our challenge is, in this globalization era where more non-indigenous with indigenous communities are interacting and are getting closer to each other. Like in the Amazons, we have a lot of not contacted communities. That means they don't have any contact at all with civilization, the Peruvian civilization. That means they live on their own way inside the Amazon. What do? We start having conflicts between non-indigenous or with indigenous. What mechanisms do we use in these situations? For example, if an indigenous comes out of its own territory and has a conflict with society or with a town or some people in a town, what mechanisms do we use? Or if somebody from the town, Westernites or Criollo, comes into a territory of an indigenous people, do we apply the local mechanisms? Do we do something different? What kind of protocols or situations or special treatment are we going to use in these cases? So more and more in situations in which there are frontiers that are being diluted because of communication, because of immigration, we have situations in which groups ethnic, cultural groups from different backgrounds, from different worldviews, are getting in conflict with one another. And the challenge and the question is, what are our protocols, our mechanisms, our processes to handle those specific situations? We know that alternative dispute resolutions may work with groups who share some common or some key elements, but when we are talking about people who are for the first time in contact or getting to know your culture, or even that getting in risk for their own health, what are the mechanisms that we are going to use in those situations? So I'm going to stop here to try to get questions and answers if you have some questions. But those are, in summary, some of the challenges that I'm seeing in developing infrastructure for peace. And I think that we are not including enough the local perspectives and the indigenous perspectives within these mechanisms. And that's a big gap that we are still seeing in these different infrastructures.
Please ask your questions. Maybe we should have a mic to take around to everybody. Or maybe you could just stand up and ask the question and then she can answer to the mic. How's that?
All right, I'll ask a question. All right, so you talked about peace in a culture that is marinating in hypervigilance. Like they're more attracted to negativity because they're surrounded by it. I'm speaking from a police standpoint, so I'm interested in what you were offering to us in reference to like police mediation. You mentioned that before. But so in teaching peace, how can someone within that particular field offer an opportunity to teach peace to those who are on the other side of the law? And so we're forgetting that they are, police are oftentimes victim-driven. So a crime is committed, we're worried about our victim, and then we're worried about prosecuting the subject. But now we're trying to transition into looking at the children who observe crime as victims as well, even though the perpetrators were the adults in a domestic situation, and getting them services. So how do you teach peace to a culture that is comfortable with the hypervigilance of expecting trauma? Like they're comfortable with it. How do you teach peace to that, to those people?
The first thing I will do is, and I will recommend, is to identify the champions within the police department, or either if we are talking about gangs and gang groups, also to identify champions within the gang groups. And I think when we were, I don't know if I was with Mary Hope, but I was working with other groups in Virginia, and there are many experiences that I've seen in which former gang members, for example, have been the most convincing and the more powerful champions into do peace work, to do facilitation and mediation even among gang groups and even police and gang groups, in different levels. The champion or the scouts, or some people they call it, is those people who have certain profile, that they are good listeners, that they have some makeup, that they're really good to work with them in terms of how to get them into learning, reflective questioning, to learning, the skills for mediation or for other models of conflict and reconciliation too. And I've seen, for example, and I know from many experiences in which the police have been into that training, and they were able to multiply later on and use it on their own, in their own work. So police that have that profile, ex-gang groups, like in Virginia, we were working with one ex-gang adult, he was like 40s already. He spent like, I think 20 years in jail, or maybe a little less, because he was for drug trafficking. And he came out and he did his PhD in education. And when he came out, he started working with youth. And he was one of the strongest champions into working for peace education with the youth. And with him, we were able to do facilitation. We did several retreats, peace retreats, with gangs, 2 gang groups, and police and gang groups too, and parents and gang groups, different actors. But the thing is, how do you start identifying those champions who can understand and who can develop and who can start making the difference? I am familiar, I don't know if you're familiar or you heard about these interrupters for violence. In Chicago, for example, they are all ex-gang members, even women too, powerful women and men. And I will say that that if you get those champions, whether you're talking about gangs or you're talking about police, you have a good entrance in there. Of course, in Colombia, they did it as a policy. They changed the policy. So they made a specific group trained for mediation. In Peru, they haven't created that policy, but they created a team for conflict management. And many of the coronels, who are now generals, they were trained in conflict management. So now they understand, and the educational piece was that they also visited other experiences and other places in which they saw other police playing a different role. So now that they are generals, they have a different perspective on their work. Yes. Yes.
I know that you've done environmental mediation around different parts of the world. I was wondering if you found it easier to do that mediation in states where there is a common law versus statutory law, because when you have common law, you have precedents, and people can read those precedents and they know the results of the conflicts. Versus statutory, often you're starting from scratch again, and kind of like often repeating the same mistakes depending on who is sitting on the court. So I was wondering about that, and then also whether one of your tools for resolving environmental crises have you developed a database in which the stories of those mediations can be retold so that people can read about them, so they would know how to apply in new cases of mediation from prior experiences within Peru?
Well, the thing on many of the cases is that those stories, they are kind of confidential to some point. There is one case, the Conga case, a very famous case that I was able to write the design of the process, and that was that's usually the exception. Most of the cases people don't. I think now there is a tendency to write more, not to systematize information, but before people weren't doing that much. But it has to do with confidentiality about information, and people feel a little concerned about that. I think that when we talk about environmental conflicts, we need to see all these channels going in parallel, and often like what is being developed at the judicial level or the administrative level, it has to be put in pause, and then what the parties will agree will help with the judicial or vice versa. So in one of the cases, the parties, they said, no, we are going to stop the judicial claim, and we are going to see how this channel, the ADR goes. And so far, they haven't need to go back to the judicial and administrative channels. I think that often they see that the ADR will go faster, or they will talk about the issues. They will be able to deal with the issues in another manner rather than through the judicial system. I think they were waiting for 4 or 5 years, and still they didn't have a monitor of the land, didn't monitor of the water. So there are some things that the ADR can help, and not the other ones. It has to be with time.
Just a question, clarification. I just wanted to know, is this the Ombudsman office in Peru that is tracking those conflicts that you showed the chart of?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just wondering about how this is operationalized. Does a conflict come to the office of the Ombudsman, and then somebody is classifying them and then kind of giving the cases to different assistants? You were working as an assistant to the Ombudsman, and from there you kind of categorizing where they go. And you started back in what, 2004 or 2000, so you have all these data, to show for it. So how was this managed?
There are offices in all the regions. So usually the people or the actors or the leaders will either come to the office in those regions and say, I have this issue, I have this conflict. Sometimes the company will do that, not too often, but that's another option. And also we used to review the newspaper to check for issues that may appear because of the parties will not come up. And then the analysis will say, okay, who are the parties, what are the problems, location, and all these characteristics, and also to analyze what are the narratives of the different parties in terms of what are the issues, what are the different components. And then each regional office has access to a system. Now they have an access to a system. Before they used to do it with Word and Excel. And they will have with a particular patterns, they will start filling the information about each case, each actor, the representatives, and they will complete that matrix. And all that information was systematized and centralized in this database that is called SIMCO, Sistema de Monitoreo de Conflictos, a monitoring system for conflict, social conflicts. Now, the SIMCO is going to be online pretty soon so that anybody can access to it. So even here, you can check SIMCO, and then you say, okay, I want to see the conflicts in Cusco, all the conflicts in Cusco, and the Cusco will give you from the year 2000, or about water. What are the conflicts about water? And it will show you all the conflicts about water. Or with a specific issues that has to do with government, national government, or about land. It will give you all that information because this system, which was developed with a German corporation, was able to structure our information, to put it straight into this. It's a platform.
Since you're working with other Latin American countries, are you seeing adoptions of a similar system in other countries?
Yes. Many of the countries, especially Ombudsman's office, they're taking on the system of monitoring conflict management. But the interesting thing is that, for example, in Indonesia, they also they have a law in which the Indonesian ombudsman they do perform the role of mediators. So they have the tools somehow not in platform, they have it more into some system, but they are interested in getting there. So I've seen many ombudsmen in different countries that they are also looking at the case, a Peruvian case, and they are developing their own capacities, looking at how the conflicts are being systematized, how they are monitoring and tracking. So there's something going on around the ombudsman, because usually the ombudsman is kind of the mediator as a classic mediator in terms of the public officers, the public institutions, and society. And society trusts the ombudsman because they are kind of like independent. They are public, but they are independent, and they have these. They have some power, some leverage to be able to say to the public officer, "Hey, what is going on? Let's go and sit in this dialogue process." Yeah. Yes.
Well, you indicated that you would like MNOs or NGOs to kind of be interactive in the resolution process on the tertiary level. Yet you also indicated that there were some indigenous communities that have not gotten contact with the main community. How do you think that would play out, having multinational organizations interacting with communities that the information on them would be limited? How would you think that would play in resolution? Why would you say there should be more, at least?
Well, usually the international corporations, they will go with the state, and the state will trust the state that they are going to facilitate or they are going to manage the case. And they will look into somebody who has reputation, that has the certificates, and that is a professional. But usually local communities, they don't care about that. They care about somebody that is trustworthy, somebody that knows them, somebody that knows the language. The language is very important. Somebody who, even if they came out from their own community, they know the customs. They know the ways of dealing with the issues. So we have the companies, they look for external mediators, and the local communities, they look for an internal mediator, you see? And often what the governments are doing is like, no, we go with external. We go with the experts. We go with those with the certificates. And they don't look at the internal resources and the internal mediators who have many things to contribute in those processes. So their challenge is how to complement both of them, how to bring them into process so each one contributes with their expertise and contributes with the knowledge that they have, process knowledge, cultural knowledge, language knowledge, and others. So when we look at many of these situations in which a large corporation will trust a government official, well, but the communities don't, not necessarily. So we need to think, and that has been hard for governments to try to incorporate somebody local to help co-facilitate the process. Like when I've been going local to handle many crisis situations, when I work with a local, it's just wonderful.
I agree.
Yeah, it's really, really nice. They know the language. They even put humor. It's just other things.
That's why I was wondering about the multinational side. Like, I think it would be better if it was local.
Yeah, but the multinational will say, local? No, that's yours. No, why should trust somebody that comes from the community? So we need to pair them and complement one with another. Yes.
In the timeline conflicts management as a tool, when you mentioned in that slide that there's around 50 to 55 years of conflict between two groups, was it easy, or in the past, was it violent type of conflict?
Yeah.
I assume it was challenging to have those two groups coming together and writing history together without having high emotions. Did it start from the first meeting to have them sitting and writing down their history as part of reconciliation and having their stories told? Or is it with time, or were they selective group?
There were the two, what do they call it, watershed management teams. The watershed management team from the high Andes, way up, and the watershed management team from the lower watershed. And the scheme that we use, or the process, was on how they learn about technical stuff, you know. Starting with technical stuff about water management, quality, quantities, and other things, and then we put the conflict management piece, you see? And then in the conflict management, which was my piece, start getting them to talk about their conflict and why they were there, and, you know, changing the dynamic, because before it was like class, which was safe for all of them. But then when we start talking about conflict, then we change the dynamic so that they could talk and do the exercise together. Together. Yeah, together. And it was the first time for them to be talking to them together. But it's possible. It is possible.
Any more questions? Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much. Can I give you a hug? That was an excellent presentation, and there's so much to think about. And you brought to life the conflict transformation model that so many of our students have been reading and studying about, and just seeing how it's applied to the local systems. And I like the way that you got us to think it's not just about the federal level, it's not just about the regional level, it's about the local levels as well, and how all of those interact. So thank you so much for bringing this to us and making us really think about how to do this kind of community building and conflict transformation. And now I'd like to bring up Jennifer Lauer, our representative from Student Government Association.
We have a gift for you here.
Thank
We
you.
have an SGA bag, and inside we have a notebook here, a leather-bound. Oh, thank you. Yeah, this is a gift bag from the SGA, and inside we have a notebook. We have a pin, a T-shirt, and a thermos.
Wow.
Tell me what the SGA is. What's that? Yeah, and the SGA is our Student Government Association.
Uh-huh. Wonderful. Great. Thank you. I'm leaving one video about Kenya. Yeah, I didn't have the time to show it, but you can share with them. But it's a very interesting case on how the different levels, they got together to try to stop the violence. It was really nice.
So we can send that to everyone.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Or the link too. It's
The link.
kind of heavy.
Okay.
Yes.
We'll
Thank
send
you.
that to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.